You very much, Gene. And thank you all. I'm sorry I can't be there today. This is a really significant effort. I applaud, Gene, your effort in trying to pull folks together and ask, is there a better way than our history to date and sort of typical implementation of the ESA? And I think the answer there is unequivocally yes. I wanted to focus on Section 7 of the ESA. That was my assignment from Gene. Section and it sort of piecemeals the statute. My colleague David Philippi from Stoll Reeves is an excellent ESA lawyer. He did a nice job of covering some of the ESA framework in the introductory video, which makes my job a little easier. One thing I'd really second that I think you've heard from Gene, you've heard from David, when you're dealing with the Endangered Species Act, you really need to manage your exposure to it, and that requires being proactive. Otherwise, if you let the process just go its own way, you're sort of paying your money and taking your chances. You'll get run over. So the theme of my talk is going to be the value of being proactive and the manner in which the ESA's implementation has evolved or is evolving currently to support that. Because I don't think there's anybody involved in work with the ESA or under the ESA that would disagree with what Katie pointed out, namely progress toward recovery isn't what we would hope. So Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act specifically applies only to federal agencies. It applies directly only to federal agencies. However, it applies indirectly to any non-federal agency, private, public, individual or entity that needs federal authorization to do something, needs a permit, needs a lease, needs a contract, needs some sort of authorization. That private sector, non-federal sector nexus, I think, is what brings this group together in particular. There are two elements to Section 7, two principal elements. The first is Section 7A1. 7A1 requires the development of conservation programs by federal agencies. Section 7A2 applies to federal agency actions and regulates pretty strictly what kinds of actions can and cannot proceed with regard to their impacts on endangered species. Historically, I think the principal focus of ESA and its implementation has been on 7A2, the prohibitions against federal agency actions that might jeopardize the continued existence in the wild of a listed species. That's the hammer. It's been very much historically, again, a command control approach. I should offer that it's probably a good thing I'm not with you all today, because the first time I went to Medford, Oregon, I was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service during the spotted owl exercise, and departmental security came around in advance of that trip and said, make sure you don't have any Fish and Wildlife Service insignia or business cards or anything like that that are visible. Tensions were running extremely high for obvious reasons, understandable reasons. That was during the spotted owl day, and sort of the spotted owl story has been replicated and played out across the country with regard to species listings driven by concerns for the species or concerns for their habitat or opposition to projects for which the ESA might be a tool to obtain somebody else's objectives. And we've gotten really, really good at regulating under Section 7 and using litigation to enforce regulation under Section 7. We haven't gotten quite so good, but I think there's good news in the progress on the softer side to the ESA, which is basically focusing on cooperation, collaboration, and being proactive in designing species conservation strategies. So I want to talk a little bit more about 7A2, and then we'll talk about 7A1, which Gene has mentioned, and how it relates to 7A2, how the two can be used together, should be used together, in my opinion. Dave Philippi spoke to that as well in his in his presentation. So to back up, the Endangered Species Act, and most in the room probably know this, it is designed to protect threatened and endangered species. There are a number of different species, or rather aspects to it to accomplish that. But something that tends to get overlooked is the purposes section of the ESA. To really understand how the ESA was anticipated to work and could be implemented to accomplish, you need to look at Section 2 of the Act, which declares what Congress's purpose was in enacting the Endangered Species Act. And when I was a kid, I never would have thought Richard Nixon was an environmentalist. It was quite an interesting take on his heritage in the ESA video. But a lot happened in the 70s. Section 2 declares that the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to establish programs for conservation of threatened and endangered species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. That's what the act was enacted to do. Secondarily, all federal agencies, and that's the language it uses, not Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA or Reclamation, BLM, Forest Service, but all federal agencies are directed to conserve threatened and endangered species and to use their authorities to further the purposes of the Act. That's a theme that you see repeated in Section 7. To set the table for Section 7, species have to be listed as threatened or endangered. That's accomplished under Section 4 of the Act. As David also indicated, once a species is listed, take without a permit or authorization is prohibited, certainly for all endangered species and for threatened species to which the take prohibition applies. Permitting is set up in Section 10 of the Act for folks wanting to do otherwise lawful activities which may incidentally result in the take of listed species, or for folks involved in conservation work, scientific study, and that sort of thing with regard to T&E species. Section 7 falls in the middle, and it sets the rules of the road for federal agencies. Federal agencies are subject to Section 9, by the way, as well. They can't take listed species without authorization, without violating the Act. So let's launch into Section 7A2 initially. Section 7A2 contains what's known as the Jeopardy standard. It provides that with respect to species that have been listed as either threatened or endangered, federal agencies must consult with either Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries, depending on the nature of the species. They have split jurisdiction over ESA listed species. Fish and Wildlife Service is generally responsible for terrestrial, land-based, and anadromous species often. NOAA Fisheries manages the balance. They do so under regs that are issued jointly by the two agencies. So 7A2 says each federal agency shall consult, and I'll refer to Fish and Wildlife Service from here on. Each federal agency shall consult with the service, Fish and Wildlife, to ensure that any action it authorizes, funds, or carries out is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any threatened or endangered species or result in impacts to critical habitat, which we won't worry about today. So what does jeopardy mean? That's sort of the prohibition. Fish and Wildlife Service regs define jeopardy as to engage in an action that reasonably would be expected, directly or indirectly, to reduce appreciably the likelihood of both the survival and recovery of a listed species in the wild by reducing reproduction numbers or distributions of that species. A couple things to note in there. The jeopardy prohibition does apply to impacts on recovery, but it does so by limiting federal agencies' ability to negatively affect or reduce appreciably the likelihood of both survival and recovery. As Katie mentioned, recovery has sort of been an afterthought in many ways in terms of the business of managing the ESA. In recent years, it has achieved more prominence, both through litigation brought by the conservation community and as a result of Fish and Wildlife Service's focus on the need to perform more effectively in recovering species. So The jeopardy prohibition is an absolute bar to a federal action that will jeopardize the continued existence of the species. And jeopardize simply means push closer to toward extinction. In order to avoid violating that prohibition, federal agencies who are contemplating an action, and as I mentioned, actions include authorization, leases, payments, anything that really makes it easier to do something. It's somewhat similar to the definition under NEPA of an action, actually pretty close. Agencies who are contemplating an action that may affect a listed species are required to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service to determine the magnitude of the effect and determine whether or not a harder look at those impacts is required. Those conversations, initial discussions, are typically referred to as informal consultation. That's significant if you want to dive into minutia, but otherwise we don't need to worry about it too much. One aspect of it is if the agency decides that the activity it's pursuing is not going to will have no effect on the species, then there's no need to consult at all. And that determination is left to the authority of the action agency. Of course, should Fish and Wildlife Service disagree with that conclusion, they can write a letter. The letter in and of itself declaring that they don't agree with it doesn't necessarily do a whole lot other than serve as a nice attachment to somebody's lawsuit if they want to challenge the federal action agency's determination of no effect. Let's assume that the agency concludes that there is some level of effect. The process moves to what's referred to as formal consultation. For activities that are deemed to likely to adversely affect a listed species, formal consultation is required. A formal consultation is what it sounds like, a fairly well-defined process. Typically, the first step is for the action agency to prepare what's referred to as a biological assessment. That is supposed to contain information to support formal consultation, and that's the responsibility of the action agency. For example, Forest Service, BLM, Reclamation. To trigger formal consultation with Fish and Wildlife, the VA is typically submitted to Fish and Wildlife Service together with a request to initiate consultation. The consultation process starts, in theory, what is a 135-day clock. The regs provide 135 days within which to complete formal consultation once it's initiated. In practice, the regulations afford opportunities for extensions, and really very, very few complex consultations are going to get done in 135 days. Very few are done in practice, whether they could be or not. But at least in theory, there's a 4-month timeline within which consultation is anticipated to be completed. During the consultation, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the action agency historically would converse, exchange information, argue, what have you. And Fish and Wildlife Service would perform what's called its effects analysis, which is they look at the baseline for the species. My colleague Lucas is going to speak to baseline later today. They look at the direct and indirect effects of the action, interrelated and interdependent actions, and cumulative effects, and adding all of that up, ask and answer the question, is it likely to jeopardize the species? If the service concludes with its exercise with the issuance of a biological opinion that documents a not likely to jeopardize or no jeopardy conclusion, the federal action is allowed to proceed. If Fish and Wildlife Service concludes with a jeopardy opinion, the action can't proceed. It's a violation of federal law if it goes forward unless the action agency applies for and obtains an exemption from the ESA. Last time that was done was as a result of the northern spotted owl. BLM sought an exemption from the ESA for timber sales in your neck of the woods and received one for some of the actions, some of the sales and some not. It doesn't happen very often. So a jeopardy opinion is pretty much a showstopper. while the agencies are involved in consultation, if they anticipate a jeopardy determination is coming, they're supposed to look for what are referred to as reasonable and prudent alternatives that accomplish the basic purpose of the activity without having that jeopardy level effect. One more piece is useful. As I mentioned, federal agencies, action agencies are subject to Section 9 prohibition against take. So if their activity, proposed activity is going to go forward, no jeopardy, but it would result in a take, then the action agency and any project proponent who's implementing the project under authorization from the action agency needs to have protection from take prohibition and take prosecution. Congress amended the act to include the requirement for issuance of incidental take statements as a part of formal consultations. Those basically are permits to cause take in implementing the proposed activity. Take has to be incidental, which means not the purpose or objective of otherwise lawful activities, and is generally measured in terms of individuals or perhaps surrogates, where it's hard to measure the number of individuals affected, but you can measure something else, like acres of habitat destroyed or sedimentation and spawning beds, for example. So that's actually long and short with regard to Section 7A2. And that, as I mentioned, has sort of been the rules of the road, and it's what we've focused on for 40 years. Recently, we've seen a renaissance with regard to the actual utilization of Section 7A1. And remember, Section 7A1 provides that Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior, quote, shall review other programs administered by him, them, and utilize those programs to further the purposes of the ESA. Ties right back to the purpose statement that we started off with. In addition, all other federal agencies, which mean all federal agencies, shall, in consultation with and with the assistance of said secretaries, utilize their authorities in furtherance of the purposes of the ESA by carrying out programs for the conservation of threatened and endangered species. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA, or National Marine Fisheries Service, interpreted that to mean that federal agencies are authorized to factor endangered species and threatened species conservation into their planning processes, whether the statutes under which they're performing planning reference T&E species or not. So it's an authorization. It's been interpreted largely as an authorization. One of the reasons I think there wasn't much attention paid to it for quite a while is it wasn't a good litigation hammer. 7A1 has been interpreted by the courts as requiring federal agencies to do something, but they have discretion to decide what it is they want to pursue. It does not require, its interpretation does not require federal agencies to perform 7A1 conservation activities on behalf of all listed species, nor does it specify how much conservation needs to be provided. And so it really is an authorization as opposed to a mandate or a hammer. And as a result, it was overlooked for quite a while, I would suggest. Early case law ratified that. The Pyramid Lake decision involving the Department of Navy said basically 7A1 is optional. You got to do something, but we can't tell you what you got to do. One thing I ought to mention, and Katie referred to this in her talk, 7A1 obligates federal agencies to do something for sure. Establish programs for the conservation of T&E species. It does not require them to recover species. There is no provision in the Endangered Species Act that mandates agencies recover species, and that's probably a good thing because we may like to think we're God, but we're not very effective in executing godlike powers. So whose responsibility is recovery? Great question. Not asked in the ESA. Indeed, the only affirmative obligation or authorization that the ESA contains is 7A1. Federal agencies shall establish programs. We'll figure out what that means later. Historically, action agencies didn't show a whole lot of interest in doing 7A1 conservation planning. And to be honest, I don't think Fish and Wildlife Service made it very easy for them to, because the service was preoccupied and had pretty much all it could handle in managing consultation workload, for which there were very, very defined thou shalts and thou shalt nots and a very well-established process. No such process existed in regulation or in statute for doing this thing called conservation under 7A1. More recently, though, Fish and Wildlife Service itself has taken a harder look at 7A1 and the possibilities, and I would suggest that the reason it's done so is because the agency recognizes, as well as anybody else, that all Section 7A2 does is reduce the level of impacts to species. That's the mandate. It does not require recovery. And so with respect to federal agencies, it's sort of a triage effect to limit impacts to species, and not necessarily a very effective tool for requiring actions to recover species. In concert with looking harder at 7A1 as the opportunity to develop affirmative conservation programs in addressing both conservation and recovery of species, the service has also started to look in some parts of the country. Practice is uneven. It's not uniform throughout the service. At activities and their ability to contribute to species recovery. I had the opportunity to work in the Southeast after working every place else during my career. Walked into the first meeting I went to in the Southeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Section 7 biologists there were talking about doing recovery consultations, and I'd never heard of that. Certainly wasn't anything like that in the regulations. And what they meant was they were adapting to a mode of looking at both reduction of impacts, but also opportunities through consultation to contribute to the recovery of species. It's an evolution, I think, recognizing that we haven't gotten as far as we would like to, as far as we need to, from my perspective, in accomplishing conservation and recovery of species, and more attention needed to be paid to recovery. 7A1, I should say, action agencies have also begun to recognize the opportunities to make their jobs easier, including ESA compliance, by taking advantage of 7A1. Remember what we started off with. If you don't manage your exposure to the Endangered Species Act, you're probably not going to like the results because the other party has a hammer and you don't. So action agencies and the rest of us, I think, have started to recognize, and the Department of Defense has pushed this as hard, I think harder than any other agency that I'm aware of, to expand the use of 7A1 and to look for what it can do for them as well as for species conservation. 7A1 provides an opportunity to plan ahead, be proactive regarding listed species conservation activities. And that's really significant. Think about how a Section 7 consultation historically, quote, typically worked. Federal agency wanted to do something, wanted to build a dam, wanted to conduct a timber sale. It did some planning. Maybe it looked hard at T&E species impacts, more likely not. That's a relatively recent development. Walked into Fish and Wildlife Service saying, we got this dandy project, and the service says, no, you can't do it without changing it in all these ways to protect T&E species. All of a sudden, the agency's back on its heels. It's backpedaling. Typically, it does not have the advantage of time, particularly if there's a project proponent in the private sector that wants to get their project done, and being told, no, go back and do some stuff differently. There's a leverage situation there that is just not something that's going to contribute to a reasonable, reasoned, well thought out collaborative solution to whatever the species impacts were that had perhaps not been addressed in the first place. Section 7A2, unless you're really looking down the road, is a reactive process. 7A1 is designed to be a proactive process. If you start looking at conservation impacts of a proposed activity or conservation needs of a vicinity, climate basin perhaps, you have the opportunity to do so without a regulatory hammer looming over you 135 days out or a year out or 2 years out. I think we've all experienced the reality that If we sit down to think about stuff well in advance of a deadline to actually do something, it's a much more even-handed conversation with our partners on the other side of the table. And that's what 7A1 can be. It can afford the opportunity for the federal action agency to sit down with its stakeholders, with Fish and Wildlife Service, say, we want to do this. Let's talk about how to get there. What do we need to do to get there? Instead of anticipating a future in which we argue about take liability, or we argue about whether or not a proposed activity meets Section 7A2 standards. 7A1 implementation is relatively new on the landscape, but the spirit isn't. Actually, I think the first activity I know of that involved this kind of let's try to sit down and figure out how to make things work happened in Quincy, up the road from where you guys are sitting. Back in the spotted owl days, there was an exercise known as the Quincy Library Group and Quincy Library Group Project, where private landowners, timber companies, workforce, Forest Service, and others sat down while timber sales were being shut down around the state of Oregon to protect the spotted owl. I suspect they sat down and said, we can't possibly do any worse if we try to figure this out ourselves than the way the process has played out in other places. And they actually were able to come up with a proposal that was perceived to meet adequately, if not ideally, the needs of all of the stakeholders. And that's what really 7A1 can be and should be used to do. Using 7A1, and there's, like I say, there's no regs to tell you how to do it. There really isn't even any policy to tell you how to do it. It gives you the opportunity to sit down and say, what's the problem? And how do we solve it from a species conservation standpoint? Which likewise gives you the opportunity of saying, how do we meet the rest of our needs and solve them while we address the conservation piece of it? I think we are pretty good collectively as a society in planning for issues and finding solutions for issues if we think about them at the front end. The longer a particular set of issues gets ignored while planning for activities proceeds, focusing on other subjects, the harder it is to redirect course. But if we sit down, I'm a lawyer, and lawyers should never throw stones at anybody. I have faith in engineers. If engineers are given all of the issues they need to solve for, do a pretty good job. And that's what I think our opportunity is with 7A1. 7A1 doesn't, as I said, have any regs. I mentioned that Section 7A2 historically involved discussions between Fish and Wildlife Service and the Action Agency, and only the Action Agency. That was the case really up into the 90s. 7A2 required the participation of the Action Agency in the service. Made no mention of public involvement. It is not a public process. There's no public review and comment required by the regulations. Fish and Wildlife Service back in the day when I was working for the agency said, it's pretty much a black box. Action Agency, if you want to let the public know what we're talking about, that's up to you and your authorities, but we're not going to require you to do so, and we're not going to do so on our own account. There's been a considerable progress in opening up involvement of interested parties, at least project proponents, under 7A2. And that points out something that's really important and applies to 7A1. There are two ways to look at a set of regulations. The typical way is I got to do what the regulations say I got to do, and that's all that I can do. And that's the way regulatory specialists and lawyers and others are typically trained. The reality is regulations tell us what we have to do. They tell us what we cannot do. They don't tell us what the art and realm of the possible is. You've heard both that the Endangered Species Act is the most powerful environmental statute in the world and that it's incredibly flexible. And there's elements of truth to both. It's one of the most stringent statutes in the world when it comes to the clarity and magnitude of its prohibitions. And with respect to those, it's not very flexible. But with respect to what it doesn't say and therefore authorizes implicitly, it's very flexible. We heard a little bit of conversation about amending the ESA. Maybe that will happen in my lifetime. It's getting increasingly unlikely. It's a political hot potato, just like the National Environmental Policy Act. Rather than hold our breaths and hope for congressional action, we need to, I think, figure out how we can make the Endangered Species Act work effectively without requiring congressional action. And the answer to that is what's authorized or what's left open between the lines of the regulations, the performance of which doesn't violate the jeopardy standard or the take prohibition. That's it. So there's a lot of opportunity to move if you don't lock yourself into saying, I got to do it the way the regs say, or you can't do anything the regs don't say. 7A1, perhaps because it doesn't even contain the regulatory framework of 7A2, I think can be viewed as a grant of authorization to pursue the art of the possible when it comes to T&E species conservation. And that's a much friendlier conversation to have, especially if we take a moment to think about who needs to be involved, whose interests are affected, whose participation is essential, and whose participation would be nice, and pull essentially a group together to try to answer the question, what do we need? What do the species need? How do species needs fit into my need for water, my crops, my interest in watching birds, or whatever? You can do that. Well, then you have to deal with what happens with regard to actually doing something. And if you have a federal agency involved, if the manner in which reclamation manages water is implicated in one of your potential solutions to the problem, and hopefully you'd have an entity like reclamation or the Forest Service, depending on the problem you're dealing with, perhaps both in your neck of the woods, they'll have their own Section 7A2 obligation. They're going to, whatever they do, if it's going to affect the species, and that's going to be a positive effect as well as a negative effect, they have to go through consultation. Well, you can use the 7A1 process to say, okay, we know that there are going to be consultations coming down the road to implement this stuff. How should they be conducted? Can we come up with best management practices that make consultations easier, less difficult? You can create, in addition to figuring out what the right answer is for species conservation, listed species, you can also say, given that answer is what we're pursuing, how do we make Section 7 consultation as efficient as possible? Because we've already done a lot of the groundwork collaboratively to try to ensure that the activities involved won't violate the jeopardy prohibition. And that's the whole purpose of Section 7 consultation. A lot of work can be done in that arena to both develop better solutions and to reduce the process costs of engagement with the Endangered Species Act. So I want to suggest that 7A1 serves as a vehicle for solving ESA challenges rather than rewarding business as usual and litigation. I can suggest a couple examples. Gene, I'm trying to take up a little extra of my time since you gave it to me. Probably the most obvious one in terms of work that's already been done was done by the Army Corps of Engineers and Fish and Wildlife Service. And remember, I suggested that if you're going to do something under 7A1, you really need to involve Fish and Wildlife Service. Hopefully Fish and Wildlife Service will instigate it and certainly participate in it because ultimately it's their process that 7A1 has to help solve. And the service will. I can unequivocally say that. Fish and Wildlife and the Army Corps of Engineers sat down and looked at decades of management of the lower Mississippi River. The Corps was managing to reduce navigation hazards, flood control, those activities. It was a substantially re-engineered river in places, and re-engineered habitat doesn't necessarily contribute very much to species that evolved with a habitat the way it came to them, the way nature had intended. So there were a number of species, including the least tern, a ground nesting shorebird, that were either threatened or endangered as a result largely of habitat loss, much of which was attributable to Corps of Engineers management of the river without specific focus or regard to species conservation needs. So after many years of proposed projects, we're going to dredge here, we're going to eradicate that island, we're going to create this one, we're going to put up dikes here. I think something like 2/3 of the, no, that's later. Much of the lower Mississippi is diked and directed and controlled. After years of Section 7 consultation and arguing and fighting, the parties decided to do something different. And that decision in and of itself is really significant, because with the typical dynamic in consultation, somebody wins and somebody loses. And the next consultation between those two agencies, somebody may be wanting to get even. It does not set the stage well for working and playing well together. The decision to try something different creates that opportunity. The Corps and the service and others sat down to say, how can we, Corps of Engineers, manage our river responsibilities in a way that certainly doesn't negatively affect least tern and other species as to the degree that our activities have in the past, but perhaps could even positively affect them. And they found out that they had the ability to do so. The Corps had flexibility in how it designed its in-river work. They just had never had the reason to think about it or to try to. And if somebody in the room has worked with the Corps, they'll probably say that's an overstatement. I'm happy to admit that's probably an overstatement, but the rhetorical point's pretty clear. They found a way to manage, including things like cuts in the dikes that allowed movement of water to provide the shallow islands within the river system upon which least tern nested, and to avoid predation from terrestrial, predators, foxes, and you name it. And it worked. It worked to the benefit of the species. It satisfied the Corps' principal mission objective of management of that system in a way that's safe for navigation and safe against flood threats and the like. It harmonized what had been regarded as either totally unconnected or competing and diametrically opposed objectives. I don't know, Gene, if you've had the opportunity to have any copies of the couple of the short handouts on the project. They're available online, and we can certainly provide links to those if folks are interested. But the Corps of Engineers, 2018, I believe, and the service and other partners entered into the Lower Mississippi River Least Tern Conservation Agreement. A year and a half, 2 years later, the least tern was delisted, not just because of what the Corps had done with working on the Mississippi, but that was a significant factor. It contributed to conservation of the species and removal of threats. So that was, that's sort of like the ideal case success story for a major federal program and a major endangered species conservation issue. That's the happy news. The less happy news is it took 16 years to do it. That was the first major effort to do something like this that I'm aware of. There may have been others. It doesn't have to take that long, but certainly in a project area as large as the Lower Mississippi River, just the logistics of working with people up and down the river are pretty significant, and that has timeline implications. A couple other examples. One is in your neck of the woods, and again, my colleague Lucas Cooksey, you should ask him all the hard questions you want. He loves them. He's really good at it. That's why he's there and I'm not. Lucas and I are working with the Department of Defense in collaboration with Fish and Wildlife Service on 2 pilot projects that are intended to pilot new ways, create new opportunities to make ESA implementation and conservation more effective and more efficient while protecting the action agency's principal mission, in that case, national defense. One's at Joint Base Lewis McChord up in Washington State. Second is in South Georgia. Each of those projects involve the military, the Department of Defense, Army, Air Force, other branches as appropriate, working together to first identify species threats presented by base operations and to identify species conservation needs. And these are for listed species, but we're trying to address not just listed species, but the other species that live there, because it doesn't do you much good to say, I only have 6 endangered species I need to worry about right here instead of 7. That's incremental progress of the sort, I suppose. The objective is to try to reduce the grounds for concern for all of them. And that's what these pilots are aimed at doing or trying to do. We're trying to see if we can accomplish that. As a part of the pilots, the agency, action agency, DoD folks are working with the service to identify and design conservation programs that will meet species conservation needs while at the same time protecting the mission of flexibility for the base. We're not making new military installations anymore. We are making weaponry that requires more and more ground to train on. So DoD has a declining asset, if you will, in terms of its ability to use that asset to safeguard national defense, and then at the same time try to figure out how to conserve listed species. Turns out listed species would rather be blown up or run over occasionally than turned into a shopping mall or have their habitat turned into a shopping mall, but it's still a very significant issue. So the objective is to design conservation programs that are consistent with mission operations and allow flexibility down the road. They also are working to design Section 7 consultation strategies. In that case, doing a programmatic consultation over activities on the base overall that also anticipates future projects and identifies reasonable and prudent measures, which if those future projects use them, it'd be relatively easy to say, okay, we said no jeopardy at the front end of this in the umbrella. This project fits the criteria to live up to and support the no jeopardy determination. That consultation doesn't take very long. Lastly, and this is something that I think Katie mentioned as well, one of the hallmarks of these activities is to identify conservation goals for species, which means progress toward recovery, the attainment of which will result in relaxation of regulatory constraints for the species. You can think of it as 3 or 4 plateaus, if you will, within a progression from the current baseline condition of species at JBLM toward ultimately perhaps being eligible for delisting. And as implementation of the conservation program and data development demonstrate an intermediate step toward that ultimate objective is reached, conservation requirements and constraints are relaxed. There's protection against backsliding because you have to maintain that progress, and the ESA requires that. But the notion of figure out how to do good things consistent with your activities and get some reward for it by your life being made easier is embedded in the design concept for these pilots. So they're exciting projects to work on. They're tangible evidence of progress, and looking for, we think, finding a better way to accomplish conservation. Because at the end of the day, I think that's something that each of us in our own way has an interest in. As a parent, I want my kids to be able to see what I see, and I expect the same is true for everybody in that room. Lastly, I want to mention an organization that is relatively new, and I'm not shilling for it. There's an organization that's been started up called Conservation Without Conflict. It is dedicated to the principle that you can do conservation differently. It has significant involvement with Fish and Wildlife Service, state wildlife agencies, other federal agencies, and the private sector, nonprofits, to figure out how can we problem solve other than through litigation. I think conservation without conflict has a very promising future. The need is incredible. We won't regulate our way to success. We still need regulatory backstops because not everybody's going to want to sit around and sing kumbaya. But providing an alternative to sitting around and enduring is the objective, and from my perspective, is the hope for the wildlife resources that created the reason, in Gene's words, perhaps, I get up, go to work in the morning, and I hope that many of us that are listening here feel the same way, because it's our current heritage, and wildlife are the heritage and legacy, one of them, that we have the opportunity to leave for our children and their children. So, Gene, with that, I filibustered some for you. I'll call it good.